Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Steinmayer. I'm Lesley's president, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the second event in this year's Thought Leadership Series. Building on the speakers program we launched last year, we've invited a diverse array of inspirational thinkers and creators and visionaries at the cutting edge of the human arts of education and counseling in the arts to join us this year. It's our hope that these programs and the conversations they inspire will serve as a catalyst for a more just and connected world. Tonight's event is also part of our annual Strauch-Mosse Visiting Artist Lecture series. And I'm so pleased that Hans Strauch, chair of Lesley's Board of Trustees, and his wife, Dari, are here with us tonight. Welcome to Hans and Dari, and happy anniversary. Since Hans established the Strauch-Mosse Lecture Series and the events began in 2009, this series has brought us prominent guest speakers, including visual artists Carrie Mae Weems and Nick Cave, best-selling writers Colson Whitehead and Edwidge Dendicat, famed Alvin Ailey dancer and company director Judith Jameson, and Broadway actor Christopher Jackson from Hamilton. So now we're very proud to add tonight's thought leader and theater artist, Nick Lehane, to this list of luminaries. I believe that Nick is the first puppet artist in the Strauch-Mosse series, and his medium both sets him apart and places him in the tradition of one of our best-known alumni artists, the late Carol Spinney, whom you know may know better as the human behind Big Bird and Oscar the Grouch. Carol served on the board of the Art Institute of Boston, which was the precursor to our College of Art and Design, and is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from Lesley. And as you'll soon discover, if you haven't already been familiar with Nick's groundbreaking work in puppet theater making, while we often associate this medium with children's entertainment, Nick's subject matter is for grown-up audiences. Nick grew up among actors and puppets. His father was a children's theater director. After earning a BFA in drama at Carnegie Mellon in 2008, Nick rediscovered his affinity for puppetry in a summer theater program. He soon started to design his own puppets and to hone his craft and to collaborate with visual artists like Derek Forjour. Nick has attracted international acclaim for pushing boundaries in the medium. He's received several grants and awards from the Jim Henson Foundation, including the Henson Puppetry Residency at the Eugene O'Neill Theater in Hartford in 2019, and the 2020 Alleloo Award International Travel Grant to perform with the London Mime Festival. It was at the O'Neill that I was fortunate to see Nick's award-winning show, Chimpanzee, a performance that I have to say has stuck with me ever since. Chimpanzee is a spellbinding solo production performed entirely without words, based on the true story of a chimp raised in a human family and taught ASL, who was later sent to live in isolation, the equivalent of solitary confinement in a biomedical lab. The story is so powerful and heartbreaking, and the audience is left questioning what it means to be human. So Nick's lecture tonight is entitled Breathing Life, the Mysterious Power of Puppetry, in which he'll talk about his creative process, I believe, and his inspirations. I am now honored to welcome Nick Lehane as Lesley's University guest speaker tonight, and later our Dean of the School of Art and Design, Amy Dynas, who will moderate the question and answer segment. Nick, the Zoom stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Janet. The honor is all mine. What an incredible group of people to be listed among. Yeah, speechless. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Nick Lehane, and I am a theater maker and a puppet artist, talking to you from my home and workspace in Brooklyn, New York. And it really is an honor to be here with you tonight, albeit digitally. I wish that there was a way that I could be with you in person, but I am grateful that this virtual medium makes this talk more accessible. What comes to mind when you picture a puppet? Is it something from your childhood? Maybe a sock with button eyes or a doll with strings? Is it a creature from the world of Jim Henson, like a Muppet, Kermit the Frog maybe, or one of the characters from Sesame Street, Big Bird, Elmo? Maybe a goblin from the Dark Crystal or the Labyrinth, Sherry Lewis's fuzzy hand puppet Lamb Chop, perhaps. Or maybe some of you have seen Julie Taymor's The Lion King, or more recently, Baby Yoda. All of this is puppetry, and I have a huge soft spot for all the puppets I just mentioned. But you've come to a talk entitled Breathing Life, the Mysterious Power of Puppetry. What do I mean by all that? First of all, what exactly is puppetry? Puppetry is the use of movement to bring objects to life in the mind of an audience. It's a broad umbrella term like dance or music with a lot of variation within it. And those puppets from before are the tip of the iceberg. These contemporary puppets have ancestors going way back to prehistory in nearly every human culture. There's archaeological evidence that suggests that puppets predate human actors in theater. There are puppets described in the writings of Plato and Aristotle. There are written records of shadow puppetry dating back 3,000 years in China and of string puppets 5,000 years ago in Egypt. The giant puppets used in Carnival and Mardi Gras celebrations today have their roots not only in medieval European pageantry, but also in the habitable statues found in Central Africa, where manipulators work from within the interior of these gigantic figures. Puppets are described in the sacred Hindu text, the Mahabharata. There are dolls with posable limbs that were used in funerary rites in pre-Columbian central Mexico. The list could go on. And this ubiquity of puppet and puppet adjacent activities across continents and cultures suggests that our earliest ancestors shared this strange impulse to animate the inanimate. Puppets indeed come from a very early time in human history. And they also reflect a very early time in humans, developmentally speaking. Puppets are linked to our early childhood. The early childhood impulses to play with dolls, to what the British psychoanalyst E.W. Winnicott called transitional objects like blankies and teddy bears. These are the first not me possessions of the child. And this liminal space between subject and object, between me and not me, is one of the many ways in which puppets exist between worlds. They're able to live in and therefore bridge gaps. They hover at the threshold of the subject and the object, the waking and the dreaming, the conscious and the unconscious, the sacred and the profane, the religious and the secular, the human and the inhuman. And this in-betweenness, or this liminality, as I will continue to refer to it, gives insight to what Jane Taylor, the director of the Laboratory of Kinetic Objects, a center for the theoretical and material exploration of the subject-object continuum, calls, quote, the enigma of the puppet. One of my earliest, most vivid memories is of a liminal time, the time between my grandmother's death and her funeral. And it's mostly a memory of my own interiority. It's a memory of a thought process, of images in my head. And it's certainly my earliest memory of mortality, and by extension, my earliest memory of being alive or being aware of being alive. I remember picturing my grandmother as bones in a casket. And I understood that I would have to dress up at this funeral, though I imagined it would involve tails and a top hat and wearing small round glasses. I had never worn glasses. I've never worn glasses since. There are several images and impressions at play here. One, my grandmother, as I could picture her, still very much alive. I could picture her face and her hair in my mind's eye. I could imagine the way she smelled very clearly. Two, my grandmother as an inert object, as bones in a box. Three, an implied invisible object or process or threshold tethering these two former images together. And 4, finally, the image of myself costumed as somehow a necessary link between all of these. And I've returned to this memory more times than I can count. And it wasn't tragic or scarring. It was just so deeply mysterious to me. I didn't have words for it at the time, of course, but looking back, this was my first encounter with the liminality of death and the mysterious threshold we'll all cross on our way in and out of consciousness. I came to mind immediately when I reread the following from Kenneth Gross's really enchanting and insightful book that I can't recommend highly enough for anyone interested in the puppet. And it's called Puppet, an Essay on Uncanny Life. Looks like this, if anybody wants to pick up their own copy. And it reads, puppet theater may also remind us that we do not know fully the different kinds of death that humans own, or the shapes of the lives that can be lived by inanimate things. That is why locating precisely the life of the puppet, or the source of its charm and fascination, is so complex, so elusive a matter, and so endlessly suggestive of the paradoxes of our own lives. My love of puppetry is not just about the heady why, but also the how, the technique. It's about action and doing, and the puppetry that I find the most enthralling and transportive almost always employs 3 main tenets. And these basic tenets are breath, gaze, and weight. And going to use a rehearsal puppet that my dad gave me after studying at a Sandglass Theater Company for a summer to show you what I mean. So the breath is the most primordial motion. Motion being the 16th century English word for a puppet show, and sometimes for the puppet itself. And how a puppet breathes is, broadly speaking, how a puppet feels. If the breath of a puppet is slow and consistent, perhaps it's calm, or contemplative, or weary. If it's short and quick, then the puppet is maybe scared or out of breath. And if it's a deep inhale, followed by a ragged exhale, then maybe the puppet's crying with sadness. And if the puppet breathes, the audience breathes along. And if the puppet holds its breath, the audience tends to hold theirs for a moment too, until this becomes unsustainable. The audience holding their breath, I mean, and then the breath of the audience and the puppet fall out of sync, at which point the image of the puppet dissolves somewhat. That's an observation made by the creators of Handspring Puppet Company, the folks who did the puppets for Warhorse, and I find it to be really true. The second principle I mentioned is gaze, and that is what the puppet appears to be looking at. And broadly speaking, where the puppet is looking, where the puppet's gaze falls, is what the puppet is thinking about. So right now, the puppet is thinking about his hand. And now the puppet is thinking about you. And now the puppet is thinking about me. And the third principle I mentioned is weight. And the weight is what gives a puppet a body and all that comes with that. the puppet's vulnerability, its sense of touch, and proprioception. And puppets are ideally, as light as possible for ease sake. This puppet is basically just a pile of rags, a couple dowels, a ball and a stick. And that lightness makes them great, floaters and flyers. But it also means that when they choose to have weight and gravity, that there's something significant or special about something that we normally take for granted, having a body. Now, perhaps the strongest example in traditional puppetry of a form employing these techniques, really where these techniques largely come from, is the Japanese form Ningyo Jojuri, or as it's more commonly known, Bunraku puppetry. It is an evolution of earlier Japanese puppetry forms that came to fruition in 17th century Osaka, where it's still practiced today. And Bunraku has had an immeasurable influence on contemporary puppetry forms. And its biggest influence is the 3 puppeteer per puppet way of manipulating. And in traditional Bunraku and in its inspired grandkids, one puppet controls the feet, another controls the torso and the right hand of the puppet, and a third controls the head and the left hand of the puppet. And these puppeteers move in concert to create an illusion of life with such stunning delicacy and sensitivity. It's, in my experience, singular in the world of puppetry. And I want to be careful to note that though I and so many puppeteers owe a deep debt of gratitude to Bunraku theater, I am not myself a practitioner of Bunraku proper. The kind of theater I make is sometimes called Bunraku style or tabletop Bunraku. And Bunraku was a major influence on my first full-length work as a creator that was mentioned earlier, Chimpanzee. Chimpanzee is based entirely on true events. In the 60s and the 70s, there were a series of experiments in the US where chimpanzees were raised as children in human homes. They were called cross-fostering experiments, and they were conducted to see how much human language these chimps would acquire, and more broadly, how human they would become. The chimps were raised with American Sign Language. They learned hundreds of signs. They had access to human toys, picture books. They would play with them much in the way that human children play. And they bonded with their human parents and their siblings. And they ate meals with their human families at the dinner table. Many enjoyed human quote unquote vices like alcohol and tobacco. One was literally baptized. And when these chimpanzees matured and became too powerful or sexual for the humans to handle, or when funding for these experiments dried up, some of these chimps went on to live as test subjects in radically different areas of scientific research. Pathogen studies performed in biomedical facilities, and many were infected with hepatitis C or HIV, or they underwent surgical procedures to study and change their brains. And most of these chimps were completely physically isolated from all other chimpanzees and humans, and they were locked away with no natural light. And the standard cage of a biomedical facility for a chimpanzee is 5 feet by 5 feet. And hundreds of chimpanzees remain warehoused in labs to this day. And I'm struck by these stories. Chimpanzees are the non-human animal that is closest to us genetically, and cross-fostered chimpanzees are the most culturally human chimps. So that makes these cross-fostered chimps as close as possible to this divide that we've constructed, that our culture has constructed between human and not human. They straddle the world between us and them. They hover in this liminal space between the two. And in a single lifetime, some of these chimps experienced inclusion in the sphere of our concern. They were part of the human family in a literal sense, of course, but also in the metaphoric sense. And then they experienced total exclusion, relegated to the realm of disposable objects. They passed between the container of the suburban family home to the container of the cage. And so, moved by these stories and these ideas, and with a team of really brilliant collaborators, amazing puppeteers, literally years of support from various artist residencies, and the unwavering support of the Jim Henson Foundation and Cheryl Henson in particular, I created this puppet play called Chimpanzee. And Chimpanzee, I think of it as an hour in the theater, a day in a biomedical facility, and a lifetime in the mind of a chimpanzee. And I would like to share with you an excerpt of the piece now. Chimpanzee premiered in New York City in 2019. And during the run, I met one of the folks who was raised alongside chimpanzees. His name's Joshua Fouts. He's the son of Roger Fouts, the primatologist who wrote the book Next of Kin, My Conversations with Chimpanzees, which was one of the initial inspirations for this piece. And Joshua put me in touch with a woman named Dr. Mary Lee Jensvold, who runs the Fauna Foundation, a chimpanzee sanctuary in Montreal that cares for chimpanzees who have been retired from research facilities, who managed to get out. And they strive to give these retired chimps as peaceful and supported and independent in existence as possible. And it's not a zoo, so they're not open to the general public. But when we toured Chimpanzee to Montreal, my collaborators and I were able to visit. We were given special permission. And many of the chimps that we met had lives that directly paralleled the lives of our protagonists. Some of them I had already read about in my research, but one that I hadn't was named Rachel. And she was clutching a small stuffed gorilla, which her caretaker said she always had and always cared for. And Rachel's nails were painted because that's one of her favorite pastimes. And Rachel was on antipsychotic drugs because of the self-harm she would inflict as a result of what Dr. Jensvold described as PTSD. And I wasn't familiar with Rachel's story, as I said, because she hadn't been raised in a chimp language experiment, but she had been raised by a person who considered Rachel her daughter until, like so many chimps like her, she grew up and was purchased by a lab where she spent decades in isolation in a biomedical testing facility. She crossed that boundary that we've set up between us and them. During the New York run of Chimpanzee, I was approached by an incredibly special artist that was mentioned earlier, Derek Forger. And Derek is first and foremost a painter. He also produces installations and sculptures. He creates these vibrant portraits and scenes that subtly address issues related to race and systemic inequality and aspiration. And his work is peopled with athletes and entertainers and others who play key roles in cultural rituals and in communal rites of passage. And they're deeply personal works. They draw from an autobiographical and culturally specific place, this well of knowledge that he has, but they also strike universal chords. And Derek and I went out for noodles and we talked about his story and his conceptual framework and the areas where our interests and our sensibilities overlapped. And he described what he saw as a sculptural kinship between our work. And he hadn't been looking to make a performance, but seeing Chimpanzee offered him this insight into the potential of puppetry as a form. And he wanted to collaborate on a co-creation. And based on his work and just him as a person, I was totally thrilled. And our collaboration took form in a project called Fly Away, which we, against all odds, and maybe our better judgment, developed and debuted in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, at Petzl Gallery in New York City. It was a socially distanced, masked, live performance. And it was part of Derek's premiere solo show in New York City, which was called Self Must Die. And the title Self Must Die had a double meaning. It was an interrogation of the inevitability of literal death, a reality made more urgent by the pandemic. And it was also a reference to an aspirational egoic death on the part of Derek as an artist. It was a cultural manifesto, and it was a personal declaration. And Self Must Die was a creative response to a time of great anxiety. It was the anxiety of the pandemic, the anxiety of hyper-visible racial violence perpetrated against Black people. And Derek created these 2 rooms of gorgeous, powerful paintings and a sculptural installation, and this hallway of dioramas examining the nature of martyrdom and the vulnerabilities inherent to living in a Black body, and the performance of competency, and this liminal space, as he put it, between autonomy and control. And it was only after taking in this visually and conceptually rich context that audiences could pass through this final threshold of the white curtain and pass from the white cube of the gallery to the black box of the theater and witness the puppet show, Fly Away. This black box that they constructed for this show was very cool, very lucky. I was very lucky, I mean. And Fly Away's central figure is a man, a puppet whose name we never know, a Black puppet surrounded by a chorus of conspicuously white puppeteers. And it had been clear from the offset that the puppet would represent a Black body. And so I had just hastily assumed that the puppeteers would therefore be Black themselves. It seemed to me like a straightforward casting logic, and that to do otherwise would at worst be minstrelsy. But Derek helped me realize that in order to interrogate these systems of inequitable interdependence that so much of his work explores, the puppeteers in fact had to be white. The whiteness of the puppeteers in relation to the Blackness of the puppet became this necessary central tension of the piece. That no matter how much this man achieves, he's always under the gaze and the manipulation of whiteness. And the piece began as this portrait in 3 acts conceptually, and it maintained that framework as we developed the show. And at the top of the show, a pine box floats on stage amid the sound of lapping waves, and it evokes something washed ashore, a boat, a coffin, a mystery. And 8 white hands sink into the box, and this man emerges. And throughout the play, he navigates a series of fateful encounters, transforming from a man mastering skills as a ball player, to a man encountering a horse and becoming a jockey, to a man being thrust in front of a crowd, performing as a drum major, reaching almost superhuman heights, until ultimately he discovers these puppeteers themselves. And he crosses the threshold between puppeteer and puppet, and all that that evokes. And I would like to show a portion of that show now. So the title of this talk is Breathing Life, the Mysterious Power of Puppetry. And the one word I don't think I've gone over yet in that title is powerful, the power of puppetry. And I think the power of puppetry at its core is the power of empathy, in breaking down and problematizing the barriers and the rigid thinking allows us a chance to fully enter into another's story, to just follow along with the puppet show, to know what a puppet is thinking or what a puppet is feeling is this massive empathetic leap. And I think saliently, it's pretty much automatic. It's a largely effortless one. And I think this says something really profound about us, that we can see the world through another's eyes just by offering our attention, by breathing along with another. I find that mysterious, and I find that powerful. Thank you so much for tuning in. And in the remaining time, if there are any questions or comments, I would love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick, for this inspiring and meaningful talk. Sharing via Zoom is wonderful, but I can only imagine how it would feel to see the performance in person. And I look forward to seeing this work personally in person, whether it's in New York or we bring you to Boston. But thank you so much for sharing with us. It's really amazing to see the choreography between the puppeteers, the musicians, and yourself. So thank you so much for showing us the ability to have anti-gravity in this world. My name is Amy Green-Dinas. I'm the Dean of the College of Art and Design, and it is my pleasure to moderate this portion of the event. So we'll do some questions and answers. But I just wanted to start off by saying that I have a lot of students. I'm sure there's a lot of students at Lesley. I know they wanted to attend, and I'm really thankful for technology and that we're recording this event. I plan to organize a premiere of this in our screening room at Lesley, so those who couldn't attend could be inspired by this presentation. Nick and I talked earlier about this presentation, and you spoke specifically about Brian Eno, and you referred to his philosophy regarding the gardener. So I just want to kind of premise at least my question by Brian Eno's words. So, quote, "Thinking about gardens and about why we like gardens has been a fruitful tangent for me. People tend to imagine that making art is like making architecture, that you can have a plan or a vision in mind before you start, and then you set about making it. But my feeling is that making art can be more usefully thought as being a gardener. You plant a few seeds, and then you start watching what happens between them, how they come to life, and how they interact. It doesn't mean there's no plan at all, but the process of making is the process of interacting with the object." So my first question to you is, what role do you specifically play in the production of these performances, and how is the gardener part of your philosophy?
I love that Brian Eno quote so much. I think it's so good. In other shows, I'm sometimes a puppeteer, like strictly a performer. I also work strictly as a designer, strictly as an actor. But in the two pieces I just showed you, I'm credited as a creator. Mm-hmm. And it means that my hand is in a little bit of everything, but it means that I'm also collaborating with other folks in the garden. I'm not sure, I don't want to call them seeds, they're also conscious minds, but I'm like a director sonographer. So on Chimpanzee, I collaborated with an amazing lighting designer named Marika Kent and a phenomenal sound designer named Kate Marvin. And it was a give and take around those designs. They were really receptive to ideas and requests and images that excited me, but they also brought, the full weight of their expertise and brilliance to the table. And the puppeteers are collaborators as well. Rowan McGee, Andy Manjuk, Emma Wiseman in Chimpanzee, and Dorothy James is the fourth puppeteer in Fly Away. And not featured here is John Riddleberger, who was a swing in Fly Away and also a valuable outside eye. And yeah, I wish I could show a rehearsal video. I didn't think to bring any, but sometimes we'll start with an image. There's an invisible horse in this scene. How does a jockey get on an invisible horse? And that'll be, you know, an hour plus of devising. Sometimes there are really clear beginning, middles, and ends all planned out. And often there's the seed of an idea that we all collectively water.
Yeah, I think it's fabulous. I have one more question. I'm being selfish, that I'll get to the Q&A. We talked a little bit about collective intelligence, which I thought was really, it's really timely for Lesley right now. We're a very collaborative community. Can you discuss your role of collaborative intelligence in your work and its production execution?
Yeah, it feels very related to the artist is gardener idea. I mean, I think Eno sometimes uses in his generative art like artificial intelligence to interact with. And I think that in collaborative theater making, you have the benefit of many human intelligences, and they create something greater than the sum of their parts. And I'm not exactly sure how. I think it's like an example of emergence, like how you know, groups of ants can do things that no ant should be smart enough to do, but collectively they behave a certain way, or how an ecosystem is the emergent phenomena from the behavior of, you know, countless flora and fauna, or how consciousness itself is emergent from stuff in ways that we don't fully understand. And I think that maybe a little less mysterious than those things, but still pretty mysterious to me, is the emergent creativity that comes out of a group of artists that are collaborating. And that even if there is sort of a hierarchy in terms of final decisions being made, or in terms of sort of vision, that those non-hierarchical moments of making are really mysterious and magical to me. And I'm not sure I have anything smart to say about them, except for that they're awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pivot now to the questions. So I have one that says, please talk about the rehearsal process. Do you have a script that you present to the puppeteers? Is there improvisation? How long does the rehearsal process take?
It's a great question. Chimpanzee is harder for me to remember and describe because it was this iterative process. It was originally a 15 to 20 minute short that I thought of as being done, and I revisited it after a year plus. In short, every rehearsal process began with a script of sorts, and then it started changing immediately. So there was an internal logic to Chimpanzee, I think before puppeteers ever touched the puppet, of this tabletop serving as the cage that had one set of rules, and this memory space that had a different set of rules. And that the transitions between those worlds would be psychologically motivated by some kind of sound or vision that the chimpanzee had in her cage. And I had a breakdown of how those scenes would go, and almost all of them changed. I think that the buzzing of the fluorescent light turning into the buzzing of a fly may be one of the only things in the final version of it that I had actually written down before a puppet existed. But the other things that grew out of it were following the same kind of, I don't want to say formula, but yeah, notions. And yeah, similar for Fly Away. That the structure of the ball player, the horseman or the jockey, and the drum major was Derek, and that was day like 2. Those are sort of iconic characters that show up over and over again in his work and have a lot of meaning for him, and then get a lot of meaning for the viewer too, because you see them over and over again in his work, and they sort of the meaning like grows and grows and grows because he almost creates like a mythological world. Anyhow, so that framework was there from the beginning. But what happened within that was largely iterative, combination of improvising, writing down, lots of cards, lots of writing out things on cards and rearranging those cards. My partner is a screenwriter, and I think she taught me that one.
So I'm going to build on that a bit. So when there's a final presentation performance, I mean, are you surprised at times where there might be a different response from the puppeteers, the musicians, based on what you've scripted? Because what I noticed in the 2 videos is just the intense understanding of gravity and emotion. I mean, the comments I'm hearing is a lot about they thank you for empathy. You know, how do you, anyways, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's interesting to know, like, is there times at the very end of the performance or when you perform where things happen that you didn't expect? Because the people behind the puppets are humans, and they have muscles and they have gravity. I mean, it has to translate into that object.
Totally. I mean, they're very subtle differences in terms of what like a CCTV camera would capture. I mean, the performances are choreographed to a fare thee well by the end. And yet there are always textures, and they're so receptive to each other. These puppeteers are so good at their jobs. I'm so lucky to be their friends, to be their friend and collaborator. Yeah, they're amazing. So yeah, if there's a momentary breath that's different, if the audience does something different, if there's a sneeze or something for the audience and the puppet notices it, everyone just, sort of shifts. And they're all making each other, and therefore the puppet, look good. Like there can't really be a mistake if everyone's working totally in concert. The day after we visited the sanctuary in Montreal, where we had seen one of these cages in person for the first time. It's outside the sanctuary, the chimps can't see it, but it's there for humans to have some context. And after that performance, there was a gravitas and a depth to the chimp's breath in the cage. There was like a heaviness that was, they hadn't like talked, they weren't like, we're going to do something different. They just all felt it and channeled that feeling into movement and breath and picked up on each other's breath. I was like, yeah, that was a concrete example of like a surprising change while still totally remaining within the lane of the choreography.
Thank you. I'm trying to make kind of trends because there's a lot of questions. There's some multiple questions about, how do you enter a process for this type of work? Is there training? What does one do with, because you have a BFA in a certain discipline, but you've spread out, and this is probably specific for my students, to our students at Lesley. How did you create this trajectory for yourself? And then if there's any recommendations or inspiration for those listening, how would one tackle this, and what does that look like?
That's a great question. Every puppeteer I know in the States' path is different. I think in countries and cultures that have older and more consistent puppetry forms, that may not be as true. I studied abroad in Bulgaria for a summer, and the Bulgarian puppeteers I met were studying on a college level either puppetry performance, puppetry direction, or puppetry design. And there's a training program at the University of Connecticut in the US that like trains puppeteers. Sarah Lawrence has a theater program that used to be run by Dan Herlin, who's an amazing contemporary theater maker and puppet artist. And so a lot of puppet people come out of that program. But I'd say most of the puppeteers I know in the US sort of fell into one of, I guess, 3 categories. Either people who are just always puppetry obsessed, like as kids, and you know, they wanted to be on the Muppets their entire lives and they just like went for it. And folks that are visual artists that wanted their work to be more kinetic and performative, or folks that were either actors or performance artists that wanted to have more visual storytelling in their work or realized they didn't want to be front and center. For me, I think that the path is movement. It was the movement training that I had in undergrad and an interest in movement of my own body and how to translate that movement into puppetry. That kind of is my through line. Where some people, it's like materials. They're like material obsessed and make like really cool mechanisms and are like all about the different foams. There's the Stan Winston School is like an online thing where you can learn creature building. There's just so many like ins. I don't really have like a good summary, but that's some.
That's great. I mean, I know that you've studied in Europe extensively, and it seems from looking at your CV and doing some research that it seems to be a more prolific practice. You know, you spent time in the Soviet Union, you know, so just that's why the question, again, it was reoccurring. I've had a lot of questions around live performances. So, you know, how large is the audience? You know, how is it different from, you know, being on Zoom? I mean, I can only imagine. What's the difference for you as the author of this, the curator, when you're in person versus what we experienced tonight?
The theaters that they've both premiered in were like less than 99 seat house black boxes, and the second show being in the pandemic, it was like, I think, less than 20 people at a time. And I think the largest theater that Chimpanzee played in seated maybe 300 people, fairly intimate. And the differences are like largely, is woo-woo a phrase that anybody says, or is that just a phrase in my family? Like spooky, like the differences are like ineffable, spooky differences. That like, I
would have done woo-woo, but that's my Midwest background.
Got you. Like, I don't know. I was raised Catholic, and I'm not religious anymore, but I went to church a ton as a kid. And there's like a sort of ceremonial, ritualistic thing that I think all theater can have, but like formal puppet theater, I think like it has more. Everyone gathered around something altar-like, doing this thing that has narrative, but isn't like narrative driven like contemporary American drama would be. That I'm not sure really translates to video or film, because everyone's in on it when they're in a theater, and there's this meeting of whatever the audience is bringing to the puppet and whatever the puppeteers are bringing to the puppet, where every human in that room therefore is contributing to this, you know, consciousness, this life in an inanimate thing. And I don't know if that's possible over Zoom, but I also don't know how much of that is like my own associations and my own take on like why puppetry matters to me. I know I'm not alone in associating puppet theater with sort of ritualistic, liturgical stuff. Like, that's not an original take. But yeah, I'm curious how many people have those associations that actually see the shows.
Thank you. I think I'll do one more question. There's a lot of kind of conversation around the different traditions around puppeteering. And so when we looked at the two videos, depending on one or the other, you know, they're clothed in black, the lighting is on them at certain points, other times they're in the background, and then there's some, you know, lighting on the musician. Is there a particular philosophy that you align with, or is it a kind of blending of different philosophies to achieve what you're trying to do based on curating this performance?
It's a great question, and I'd say yes and yes. There's the tradition of bunraku, as I mentioned earlier, is a big influence. There's also Czech or Czechoslovakian, I think it's called black theater. It uses black light now, but I think before black light, it was just really harsh side lights that would allow the puppeteer to disappear out of the light. And sometimes an analogous effect is achieved in Fly Away with overhead lights. I have sort of taste and preferences around the way puppeteers and puppets interact as a baseline, and I am interested in toying with those for dramatic effect.
Mm-hmm.
So I like puppeteers to be visible in terms of not being cloaked in stuff that I make. I mean, I think them being cloaked is like totally legit in other people's work, and I may incorporate that in the future in my work. But there's a kind of choral, like Greek choral quality, and a sort of invested yet passive, like a compelled and repelled quality, to quote Tadashi Suzuki, I think, that the puppeteers can have towards the puppet that I think cues the audience to focus. And it creates, I had a teacher, God rest his soul, named Mladen Kiselov, who always talked about the ball of attention, that there can be only one ball of attention on stage. And I think the puppeteers help create that focused attention on the puppet. So I have a strong preference that unless we're subverting it, that the puppeteer is always looking at the puppet, where, you know, in Avenue Q, I'm pretty sure that the puppet and the puppeteer are both like looking in the same direction, which has a different, totally valid effect. In Chimpanzee as a whole, there's this transition from the puppeteers behaving in the way that I'm describing to disappearing out of light, so that their hands become characters, and then later their bodies take on sort of symbolic meaning. They become the cage and they become pain. And I'm really interested in the relationship between the puppeteer and the puppet, and I hope that I can continue to find and steal from, you know, better artists than me, ways that the presence of the puppeteers, it becomes like, you know, meaningful and varying in the future work that I do. So I love that question. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you. Well, that was from the audience. I have more questions, but it's after 8, and I don't want to take more time from you, Nick. I want to thank President Steinmayer for identifying your talent and bringing you here to Lesley. I think it's been such a pleasure, and it really is a meaningful time for us at the college and the university to think about the way you work and the kind of intersections that we can start to think about within our program. So I hope to welcome you in Cambridge at one point and have a on-ground presentation of your work if you're able to do that. And thank you so much. Super gracious and really inspiring. Beautiful work. And again, the last thing I'll say in terms of the Q&A is so many folks have said how grateful they are that you are able to explore empathy through these puppets, and that they become really human-like. We all need to remember that.
Thank you so much for having me, and happy anniversary to
Yes.
the anniversary couple.
Yes, let's all clap.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We'll follow up. But yes, thanks again. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining and looking forward to our next Strauch-Mosse lecture. Bye, Nick.